Cool.
All right, so you might not remember me. I met you when you were in Australia, um, briefly. I saw you
Sydney.
in, yeah, speaking of Bankstown.
All right.
Um, we had a brief talk. I talked to you about Trump, whether Trump was a protectionist in your
Right.
mind. Um, so basically, I've got a fairly nuanced view on Israel. I'm part of, I'm pretty right wing, and I follow a lot of conservative sources, which tends to be they tend to be really pro-Israel. And then again, I hear arguments from libertarians like you who are very anti or critical of Israel. So I'm kind of in this place where I don't really know what to think. So I've gone and absorbed all these pro-Israel sources, and I just want to ask you incredibly contrarian questions and see what your rebuttal is.
Well, that's fine. And I can tell you on the left, you'll find pro-Israel sources also. It's pretty
Hmm.
uniform, at least in the United States. And I think probably the same thing in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I was even, as you know, let's just get to the questions first, and then we'll kind of do a debrief. All right,
All
so
right.
let's just double check. I'm recording. I am recording. Okay. So, I'm talking to Ryan Dawson. Ryan, could you just describe yourself and what you do?
Sure. Um, I am a geopolitical analyst, and I am a an activist. We used to say for social justice, but I don't want to say that label anymore because that's been hijacked and taken over. But
Sure.
I mean actual social justice, not identity politics. I'm anti-war. I try to give a voice to the voiceless, Palestinians, Yemens, people who don't have a large voice, don't have any support in the media usually in their conflicts. They're just getting bullied by everybody. So I just do podcasts and I make films and I write books about geopolitical issues and economic issues mostly. And I also am a historian, and my twin brother's an archaeologist, so I dabble in that as well.
Sure. Okay, so it's fair to say you're, since we're going to be talking today about Israel and Palestine, it's fair to say you're critical, or would you say you're anti-Israel?
Well, I'm against the government of Israel as it stands. I'm not against Israel existing. And a lot of
Okay,
people, that's their like it shouldn't exist. I'm like, I'm practical here. I mean, it already exists. What do you plan on doing to get rid of it?
sure.
So to me, that's always been ridiculous. But it cannot exist in its current state where they're building Jewish only colonies, for example, in the West Bank. I mean, I don't know how people rationalize ethnic cleansing and racial segregation, but they do, or they just ignore it. And that just hurts Israel in the long run.
Okay. So with political issues like this, I consider it quite logical to turn to those with significant experience in the Middle East. An example of this is Colonel Richard Kemp. He's the former commander of British force in Afghanistan and expert on Middle East conflicts. So he claims that Palestinian leaders do not want their own state, as despite efforts by a plethora of countries, including Israel, the US, and others, Palestinian authorities reject offers of a two-state solution. So surely if Israeli authorities are in support of a two-state solution and Palestinians are not, it's fair to say that Israelis are the only group actually advocating for a solution or peace, isn't it?
No, because they've never really been offered a two-state solution. What the two-state solution they were offered was saying, all right, Israel continues to have 80% of the land, annex all this land past the demarcation line. They've built a wall, which is not even on their border. It cuts into Palestinian territory, so that takes even more territory. And then within the little bit of land they have left, all the aquifers, hilltops, and settlements remain. So it's like a state of Swiss cheese because you have all these little Jewish, not even, there's cities the size of Philadelphia of settlements, which are areas where only Jews can live. If you're not Jewish, you're not allowed to live there. It's Jewish only houses, Jewish only highway, Jewish only everything. And they have checkpoints and roads where Palestinians have to go on one road and the Chosenites on another road. So that's not your own state. You don't have sovereignty of movement. You don't have can't own your own land. You can get bulldozed. And so that whole generous offer myth is baloney. I mean, you're talking about less than 18% of the land, and most of it is the most useless parts. It's like an Indian reservation. I mean, that's the joke. And so in a title, you can be like, hey, we offered you two states after already taking 80% of your state, and then, you know, that's just BS.
Okay. So Kemp also claims that Israel is frequently targeted by global authorities and held to high and very unrealistic standards. So he said this is evidenced by the fact that in 2015 alone, the UN adopted 20 resolutions against Israel and just three for the rest of the world combined, including only one for Syria, a regime that has murdered over 200,000 people. So in 2016, the UN Commission on the Status of Women condemned only one member for violating women's rights, and that was Israel, with no condemnation of countries like Saudi Arabia. Do you think that Israel is being fairly untreated by global authorities?
I don't think that's true about Saudi Arabia, and no, I don't think they're being unfairly treated because nobody else is building ethnic colonies. Nobody else. There's not a state in the world that has like the white only, the black only, the Latino only cities that they build by demolishing private property, taking it with a standing army. For, I mean, no one's doing that. Syria isn't going into Turkey, bulldozing houses down and then building, Arab only, Syrian only cities. Only Israel is doing that, and the reason there are so many resolutions is because none of them pass. They propose the resolution and it fails because the U.S. is on the UN Security Council and they always veto it, even if it's 100 against one. And this has happened many times before where the entire planet votes one way and the U.S. votes the opposite, and so it doesn't go through. They finally had one go through because the U.S. abstained. They didn't vote against it or for it, and then all the rest of the entire Security Council voted for it, of course. Because there's no doubt that what Israel is doing is totally unjustified. It's ethnic cleansing. And that has happened in any state in the past that has behaved like that in the past, has been condemned in the past. Iraq was invaded for being accused of violating one UN resolution, UN Resolution 1441, which stipulated they couldn't have weapons of mass destruction after the first Gulf War. Well, they didn't have any, and they got invaded anyway, and 1 million people are dead, and their cities were demolished, and they had all the rape, torture, and sectarian violence, and all the joys that come from that. Israel's been breaking UN resolutions. It's all hot air politics. They've been breaking them for decades because they're never enforced. So the UN can shake its finger, but it doesn't ever do anything. So Israel doesn't change its behavior.
Okay. What do you say of let's bring it home more and kind of a I suppose a Palestine v Israel argument. What do you say of those who claim that Palestinians appear to seek more than anything else the destruction of the Jewish state? An example of this is that during the Second World War, the Mufti of Jerusalem even persuaded Hitler to bring the Holocaust to the Middle East. And following the Second World War in 1948, with the birth of Israel, 5 Arab armies descended on the nation in an attempt to destroy it. And today, Palestinian media, I've seen some of this, is flooded with children's shows attempting to indoctrinate children to hate Jews at a young age.
All right, there's a bunch of things that aren't true there. First, Hitler did not bring the Holocaust to the Middle East. The opposite actually happened. The Havara Agreement, which was made with the Jewish Agency, which was sort of the government in waiting that became the Israeli state up until 1939, were taking Jews from Europe because they were thrown out of Europe and putting them in Palestine, and Palestine welcomed them in. But after World War II, the Stern Gang and Irgun terrorists from the Israeli side went around shooting people in mosque and terrorizing people. The British had came in and confiscated guns from the Palestinians, but not the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis ended up taking over more land through force. And it wasn't that 5 Arab nations ganged up on Israel. Israel started that conflict, and they had the support of France and the United Kingdom. So it wasn't like little Israel by itself fighting the Arab world. Sykes-Picot had created a lot of these countries to begin with after World War One. The Zionists have been wanting the Israeli state where Palestine was. Palestine was invaded several times during World War One, and what the British had done is they had promised all these little groups within the Ottoman Empire pieces of dirt if they would side with the Allied powers during the First World War. And so the Sauds and the Zionists got their way. Everyone else got stabbed in the back because, of course, the British were promising the same piece of land to different groups, and they couldn't deliver to both. But they were lying to everybody because they just wanted infighting within the Ottoman Empire to weaken the Turks and help win the war. And they were willing to say anything and do anything to win. But in the conclusion, of course, they couldn't keep all their promises. So a lot of people felt bitter and felt stabbed in the back because that's exactly what had happened to them. So they start fighting with each other, and it's nothing new. But the Israelis confiscated land, and it was even after that, after 48, they started planning in 52 to take the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and they got busted in a false flag operation. It's known as the Lavon Affair. This was it didn't get going until 56, but Pinhas Lavon was actually a fall guy. He was the defense minister of Israel. Benjamin Gavili is the one that orchestrated the whole thing, but it fell apart because what they were doing is they're going around bombing Western targets as a pretext to keep the British wanted to keep this control of the Suez Canal, which is in Egypt, and of course the Egyptians want the Suez Canal, and but they need a reason. And Europe's very anti-war after having two world wars, you know. So they went around bombing movie theaters and things like that. But one of the guy's bombs went off prematurely in his jacket. They went through his house. They searched through and they figured out it was actually Israelis pretending to be Egyptians bombing targets. And so that got bottlenecked in court. And they had a war in 1956 over the Suez Crisis, where France and the UK helped the Israelis attack the Egyptians and Syrians. That war is always skipped. They go from 48 to the Six-Day War, and they don't talk about the 50s. But clearly, you can't start the middle. You can't understand the Six-Day War until you understand that Israel had attacked these places in the 50s in the first place based on a false flag. And even the Six-Day War, the Israelis started too. They want to say that Egypt was building or amassing forces on their border. It just isn't true. Egypt was already at war with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. They call it Egypt's Vietnam, and they were losing that war. There's no way they're going to start another front with the Israelis. But the Israelis had an opportune time to do it because as a result of what happened in 56, President Eisenhower of the United States was not a Zionist, and he thought it was ridiculous. So he put UN peacekeeping forces there for 10 years. That was from 1957 to 1967. 2 weeks after they were removed, Israel attacked Egypt again, and Eisenhower was no longer in power. Johnson was in power after Kennedy had been killed. And Johnson was a hardcore Zionist. His aunt was in the Zionist American Council. He's the first Jewish president of the United States. And he, along with the Dulles brothers and others who had left over there, like Ted Shackley in the CIA and James Jesus Angleton in this group, were pro-Zionist. And so then you get the USS Liberty and so on from there to the Six-Day War. But yeah, this idea that, oh, look at little Israel and all these Arab countries ganged up on them. Israel preemptively struck the Egyptian Air Force while it was on the ground. That's why they got attacked. And they had allied powers. They weren't fighting by themselves. To me, like
Okay,
this
and
idea of like, look at all this Arab land is as stupid as saying, well, white South Africa is okay because look at all this other land in Africa where the blacks can go live. They can just go live over there. Well, you took South Africa too, and there was no state of Israel until the 40s. It had always been Palestine. In the mythology, there's a state of Israel, but in real history, there's never a state of Israel. And you got a bunch of Europeans migrating down to the Middle East and creating a state. Most of them are from Poland. They don't speak Hebrew, or they're just Europeans. It's just European colonialism under a new religious theme.
okay, so what of Palestinian media? Do you think that that it is full of certain propaganda?
I don't think it's propaganda. I mean, my friend was just there, and he asked the man about that who he's staying with, saying, "Look, do you teach your kids to hate these people?" And you walk outside, and like 2 in the morning, actually that night, the Israelis had come in and fired tear gas into their houses. They just do this, terrorize the Palestinians. And then this boy's father was arrested for the third time. His brother, 11-year-old, had been shot through the eye with a rubber bullet and is blind for the rest of his life. And then the same kid got shot through both legs with an illegal weapon, went through one knee and then went through the other, facing sideways. His sister was killed. And, this boy cries in terror. This little kid, because he's scared they're coming back. He's like, do we need to teach them to hate these people? I mean, they hate them because of their actions. They humiliate them. They beat up their fathers in front of them. They force them to go through checkpoints. They suddenly you just can't drive on the road if there's a Jewish holiday or something. They'll shut down mosques. They force them to move. They put them on a calorie diet. In Gaza, they have a blockade. So I mean, they blow up their university. They blow up their hospitals. They blow up their schools. They cut electricity off. They cut the sewage off so it overflows in the street. There's no need to teach Palestinians to hate their oppressors. It's like teaching black slaves to hate their masters. It's just self-evident. They do, however, on the other side, have puppet shows and things for the Israelis to hate Palestinians and act like the Palestinians are the boogeyman and are after you all the time. But you really don't need that propaganda on the Palestinian side. They live it every day.
Hmm. Okay, so several times you've compared Israel to an apartheid state. Um, now I kind of looked this up, and I found a source uh, showing many different Arab citizens who have been elevated to celebrity status in Israel. For example, Walid Badir is a famous Israeli footballer.
Hmm.
Mira Awad is an Arab woman and representative for Israel in the 2009 Eurovision. Now, despite this, in Jerusalem, on the other hand, the Pact of Umar is a treaty applying to non-Muslims, which declares they may live in Jerusalem only if they follow certain rules. For example, Christians may not be seen with Christian books or symbols in public. Non-Muslims should rise from their seats if Muslims wish to sit, and there is even prohibition against burying non-Muslim dead near Muslims. Now, wouldn't you say that the Palestinian actions and laws in Jerusalem is far closer to apartheid?
No, because first of all, the apartheid's in the West Bank, which is not part of Israel yet part of Israel. They've annexed territory away from Palestine, and they've built Jewish-only cities that are segregated, and only Jews can drive on the roads. The high schools are segregated in Israel. Arabs go to one school, Jews go to another school. So it is racially segregated. And in the West Bank, there's a pecking order. And there's even a pecking order among Jewish groups within Israel. Certain Jews rank higher than others. There are Muslim groups in Palestine, all over the world, that have ideas of their own stupid supremacy. Like Hamas, for example, it's a fucked up government. And there's the Islamic State, there are Salafist groups, there are Wahhabi groups, but it is wrong to collectively call that the Palestinians, just as it would to blame the Jews for what Israel's doing. It isn't the Jews, it's Zionist, and it isn't the Muslims or the Palestinians, it's Wahhabi Salafist. And yeah, you should condemn religious extremism, no matter what religion it is, whether it's Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or whatever. But the thing is, they don't control a country. They're not taking $4 billion a year from the United States, and they can talk about whatever they want and they can say all kinds of trash, but they're not going into Israel and bulldozing down houses, kicking Jews off their land and segregating it themselves. That's happening to them.
Okay, could I just get a definition for like how do you define Zionism? Because I know it as people who support the Jews having their own state.
All right, so does that mean a Jewish state?
I mean, yeah, that's the definition I knew
So
it as. Yeah.
what is a Jewish state? I mean, it's like to me, I'll quote Einstein on that because they offered him the first prime ministership of Israel, which he refused because he said having a Jewish state is as stupid as having a Jewish bus or a Jewish chair. States are not biological things. States are ideological. You can believe in principles of freedom, you can have a certain value set, but it's not dependent on biology. And Israel, although they'll allow Arabs to live there, is wants to maintain a biological demographic Jewish demographic as the majority, and they're really scared that everything would change if that demographic changed. You can acknowledge Israel as a state, but it's not a Jewish state. That's as silly as calling the United States a white country, like a white state. It's not. It's just a country, like every other country in the world. And you could say, like, well, here's a place where mostly Asians live or mostly whatever, but it isn't defined like that. Japan or whatever, they're not defined by race or religion. countries, especially secular countries and democracies, which Israel claims to be, uh, can be acknowledged as a state. But when you say Jewish state, what are you saying? Are you saying it's more for that group than anyone else?
Mm. Okay, so I've heard a lot of people on the right say that they support Israel because it's the only Western democracy within the Middle East. How do you respond to that?
Where are they getting that from? Lebanon's a democracy. Syria was a democracy, especially before all of this conflict. There are only a few kingdoms in the Middle East. Almost the entire Middle East are composed of democracies. Iran has a democracy. So that's just wrong.
Okay, I think that's enough of me playing devil's advocate.
Plus,
Um,
who cares if it's a democracy or not? Like, why does
mm,
it have to be a democracy? Democracies are not some guaranteed preventative measure against imperialism.
mm,
If you look at like the death tolls, you're like, okay, the communists killed tens of millions of people and the fascists killed millions of people. The imperialists under democracies have killed hundreds of millions of people. I mean,
sure.
no one has killed more people than the United States. So that it's not like, well, we voted our oppressor in. Like that doesn't mean
Yeah, I
anything.
understand. Okay, so let's have a bit of a debrief. I already knew, looking at some of these questions I was going to ask, I just kind of wanted clarification from you. For example, the whole persuading Hitler to bring the Holocaust to the Middle East, I kind of knew that was complete nonsense. Like when you're looking at the stuff, it's as if there's just walls and walls of propaganda. You have to take down kind of misinformation.
The Zionists actually agreed with Hitler. I mean, some people call the Holocaust a rich Jews' way of sacrificing poor Jews in order to get Palestine. Because they also wanted Europeans to migrate, European Jews to go to Palestine. And the
Mm,
Nazis wanted the same thing out of prejudice, though. I mean, they're anti-Semitic. They wanted them out. But a lot of Zionists wanted that land for their religious belief that it's theirs. You know, God's a real estate agent, and so they want that piece of dirt.
mm. So I've always thought about it kind of like this. When it comes to people like white nationalists, I'm very libertarian. So when it comes to people like white nationalists, I've always considered that I think they should have the right to have their own state if they like. Like say if white nationalists like Richard Spencer and Jared Taylor wanted to have their own little commune somewhere, I can't see a moral reason to oppose that as long as they're not hurting anyone else. And I kind of feel the same way about Jewish people. Like I think if Jewish people say, let's not think about it in terms of Israel, but if Jewish people had their own commune somewhere, and they legally obtained the land and they had it, there'd be no real issue.
No, I think having ethnic states is definitely the wrong direction. You just end up with balkanization. And
Mm,
a lot of ethnicities aren't, I mean, you can just invent them. Like what the Kurds would like to have a state. You know, look at what happened to Yugoslavia. It broke up into six, now seven different little countries. You can always have, it's just going to keep more and more rigid in groups that will divide and say, well, I want my state, and the Serbs want a state, and this group wants a state, and
mm,
they wanted that to happen in Syria. They wanted the Alawite region, they wanted a Sunni region, they wanted a, and they're all the same race, but they divided themselves by theology and create all these little ethnic states. And Jews too, like it's not a race. The Jews are made up of lots of different races. Most of them are
mm,
European, some of them are Arabic, whatever. In their minds, they think of themselves as a people, and half of them don't
sure.
even believe in their religion either. So it's not based on that either. It's just that this idea is it's silly. And then as far as like Richard Spencer and them go, if you want to live in a gated community or something of people who look like you, whatever, you have the right to do that, sure. But it's kind of LARPing because it's like, look, in the United States, for example, you know, some 40% of the country is non-white, and where do you want them to go? You know, like they're part of the United
Sure.
States. Like it's ridiculous to me. Like, wait, that guy can't live here and open a business and stuff because he's not of the right genes. And then you got all these people that are of mixed genes too, like myself and my kids. Like, which category do we
Mm,
fall under? You know, it's just retarded to me. Like, your culture is not genetic. They have this idea that like a bunch of white people are going to think this way and create this kind of place, and a bunch of black
Mm,
people are going to think this way. Like, just look at the two Koreas. They got the same language, they got the same genetics, as same as possible because both, I think North Korea is 100% Korean and South Korea is like 98% Korean. And one is like the 11th largest economy in the world, and the other's dead last. One's got a communist
sure.
dictatorship, the other doesn't. It's not like there's some teleology of race that's going to lead to a certain type of state. You see different states with the exact same racial makeup, like Russia when it was USSR versus now, who have taken on very stupid ideas and then changed their minds. It doesn't, anybody can fuck up. And communism is a great example of that because you could look at Venezuela or Cuba or North Korea, China, Russia, or the East, and no matter what race it was, they all failed.
Mm. Well,
What
I
matters
always
is
see
the
it as,
economic
yeah,
philosophy, and philosophy is not tied to
absolutely.
race.
I always see it as incredibly naive because they have this idea that as long as everybody's white, then a totalitarian government won't take over, which is just completely absurd.
Yeah,
Of course.
they've had
Um,
plenty. You had fascist Italy. You had, I mean, you know the examples. So
yeah,
I think what it is they don't like. They see crime statistics and stuff, and it is just a fact that about 80% of violent crime is by minorities in places like the United States, Britain, and so on. And to them, they see that as like, well, that just means like that these races are prone to behave that way.
it's a very simplistic way of looking at it.
It is because if you break that down further, you go, well, look, if you're talking about murder or something, you're talking about one out of every 100,000 people. And so, less than a tenth of 1% of the people are doing all of the crime. So
Mm.
even if you say, well, all right, blacks have 50% of the crime, well, it's only a tenth of 1% of blacks that are doing anything wrong. What you ought to look at is the drug war and liberal policies that foster, degenerate behavior
I
by,
think it was before before the '60s. I seem to remember hearing that blacks had a similar crime rate to whites before that.
and when it was completely segregated and all blacks lived together, they were not shooting each other as much as they are now. But that was before the war on drugs.
Right.
See, poor people are attracted. It's like, if you fix the high school dropout rates and single motherhood, I guarantee you wouldn't have so much crime. Like there are
Yeah.
factors that contribute to that, and they're not racial. It's just it's a class thing. And
Mm.
you'll get the same meth heads and stuff among white populations, when they have the same economic conditions. They get attracted to selling drugs because shit, you can make $600 in an hour selling cocaine. Like what they're looking at high school, like, do I really want to work at McDonald's the rest of my life, whatever? Because that's how they see their future. And so they go into drugs or prostitution or something where you can make a lot of money really fast. And because those are all black markets and illegal, it ends up turning to crime.
Sure.
And you're still talking about a very, very small part of the population, but
Mm.
it is enough. I mean, there's someone dead in Chicago every day. Someone gets shot every
Yep.
day. Yeah. But it wasn't always like that,
And
even though we
that's
had about
despite
the same
having
racial
very strict
makeup.
gun control.
Sure. Yeah, well, Chicago banned guns, and they
Yep.
have more shootings than anywhere else. I mean, it's like, well, drugs are illegal, so people do them.
Yep.
The law is not what corrects the behavior. You have to
No.
correct policies. And
It's also just culture.
yeah, it's cultural, but it's actually a lot of it's political. I mean, if you didn't
Mm.
subsidize single motherhood and the father stayed in the home, I mean, that's the most, like, if you want to look at correlation studies, if two-parent homes are not having on any measuring stick the problem of single-parent homes,
Mm.
and you're subsidizing failure with the welfare state, like, why should someone try to get a job when they can collect unemployment and keep all their leisure time? Well, they
Mm.
don't, and that has consequences when you live that way with no responsibility and no accountability. That has major consequences. You can
Okay,
see that
let's
system with the Indian reservations, the Indians that live off the reservations versus on. Indians on the reservation, you got problems with alcoholism, high school dropouts, like everything's terrible. Off the reservation where there's no nanny state, you can't even tell the difference. They blend right in
oh,
with anyone else.
I didn't actually know that. And is that the do the majority of Native Americans live on reservations or?
Well, in the West they do, and in the East they don't. So,
Right.
in certain areas it's the majority, and overall, I don't know the answer. It's pretty close to half and half, I would guess. Thing is, you don't really have statistics on people off the reservation because they don't. It's hard to. What do you? There's so many pretendians, like white people that say they're Indians. I don't know why they
Oh,
do
really?
this.
Yeah,
There are a lot
yeah.
of pretendians.
It's kind
Who
of a
might be
trendy
like,
thing.
1/32nd native or something, and they just
Yeah.
people love to be the minority or whatever. I don't know.
Get a feather tattooed, all that.
Indians have this mythical thing like unicorns. Like they're either totally demonized as savages or overly romanticized as like some utopian society or whatever. And so the people of that group want to be Indian because it's like cool. It's like ninjas or something. It's just like neat,
Yeah.
It's like I don't know. So it's hard to
Yeah,
get
yeah.
stats.
I find middle class white people do that a lot. Kind of romanticize other cultures.
Yeah, they do. And I'm like, look, there are some good things, some bad things. You know, it's neither one, neither answer is right. But they seem to
Okay.
look at Native Americans as either like, well, look, they didn't have jails, they didn't have taxes, they didn't, all that's true. But you can look at a lot of bad things also. So,
Mm.
it is what it is.
Okay, let's delve into the alt right a bit more. So I spend a lot of my time arguing with members of the alt right because I find they are totally irrational about a lot of things. So I even agree with them on certain talking points, such as I have a big problem with Jewish tribalism,
Hmm.
um, which is it's a massive. I consider it a massive problem.
It's ethnic
But they,
nepotism.
it's what, sir?
I call it ethnic nepotism.
Mm,
You're not basing things on merit. You're basing it on are they part of my team or whatever.
sure,
And it's just
but
wrong.
but but I mean, the alt right though, they take it to such ridiculous lengths that um, I've heard a lot of them talk about white genocide and how they think there's some giant conspiracy to wipe out the white race by Jews,
Yeah,
which
see,
there's not
that
really a
kind of
tremendous amount of
exaggeration
evidence.
hurts their own cause. Because
Mm,
if you want to say something like, there's no white genocide, it's not like all the white people aren't being killed off. What's happening though in places like Sweden is certain sectors of their cities are being taken over by migrants, where it's unsafe to go there if you're white. And so
sure,
there's a cultural genocide.
no doubt.
Genocide's a big word. I mean, they're being displaced by immigrants. And you do have the right to maintain cultural integrity. You do have the right to demand assimilation. I mean, if Japan didn't have strict borders, where this is where I live in Japan, it would become Chinese almost overnight because
Mm,
Japan's a very wealthy place. China, although they have money, most of China is dirt poor. Like they have over 200 million people that live on less than $2 a week. They would flood into Japan to try and reap the benefits, and Japan would not be able to raise them up. All that would happen is it would drop Japan down. And you can come to Japan if you're Chinese, you can immigrate and assimilate, but you can't just open the door and allow everyone in at once, or you're going to lose your own culture, lose your own language, you're going to lose a lot of things. And under the cover of this altruistic idea, like, well, we want to help refugees. Yes, you should help refugees, but most of these people aren't refugees just because you call them such. A lot
yep.
of the immigrants in Northern Europe are just lazy asses from North Africa that want welfare. I mean, and you're
Mm,
to say that people are like, "What are you racist?" I'm like, "No, motherfucker, that's just a fact." It's like I'm not racist at all. But you can't. It didn't. Even if it was going the other way, it doesn't matter. Like it, you cannot have. You couldn't have floods of East German going into West Germany, like which is something that happened because they couldn't absorb all those unskilled laborers and things. Like there has to be a process. And
sure.
yeah, number one, stop bombing them, stop giving predatory loans out. Like the IMF, if they didn't completely decimate places like Sudan or Egypt with this usury gambit on loans and depreciate their currency and so on, then you wouldn't have the economic conditions that make people want to leave and go somewhere in the first place. If it wasn't for
Mm,
NAFTA, there wouldn't be so many Mexicans out of work that are going to Texas to look for some, you know what I mean? You have to start the story at the start instead of the middle. Like you can try and adjust, you can say like, well, we're just going to shut our border and fuck off. Well, still you have the problem like all these people with no work and they're just going to cause problems somewhere else. So I think why not fix
mm,
the underlying economic conditions that create the excess labor force and so on first, and then you don't have refugees, and then you don't have to deal with them. Like
Mm.
they never
Stop the
want to
welfare
strike the
state.
root. They want to react to the symptom instead of like what's causing. Like, why are there so many poor people in northern Africa? And
Mm.
no, it's not because they're African. You know,
Yeah.
like, but that's what they. I think that's what they think. And there's such. And this is what liberals think too. But there's such a taboo on talking about something like that because maybe in the back of their head they think, well, it's just a bunch of niggers or whatever. So, but they don't want to say that because it's not socially acceptable. So they never have that argument. They all dance around it. It's like, oh,
Mm.
because I just did a video about guns control in the United States. I mean, like Brazil's got quadruple the number of gun deaths as the U.S. Mexico has more. Venezuela has more. Colombia has more. And people are like, yeah, but those aren't first world countries. Like they still outlawed guns and people are getting shot. So
Mm.
what they're really saying is, well, those countries aren't white, but they can't say that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they say first
Sure. Yeah,
world
yeah.
instead. I'm like,
Yeah, yeah.
nah, no, no, no. Like, and
Uh,
within the United States, who's doing the gun violence? Mostly,
mm.
it's minority
Yeah,
groups, right? So
of
like,
course.
but they don't want to say that
Yeah.
because it sounds and it does sound racist. But like I was
Mm.
breaking down earlier, it's not racism. That it's not some inevitable part of being a minority that makes a tenth of a percent of them go out and shoot people. It's liberal policies. But see,
Mm.
a liberal can't say that because then they got to admit that their policies are wrong. So they
Of
make it
course.
about race and then say you're not allowed to talk about race. So they
Mm.
blame the guns. It's the tool is the problem instead of the people pulling the trigger. Because they can't underline and look at the welfare state and show the conditions it's made everything worse. These minority
Mm.
groups are doing better in the 50s than they were in the 80s. They had less violence, they had more two-parent homes, they had more people going to school, they had everything better before the welfare state came in and before the war on drugs. So those are the two things you got to change in the United States and places like Sweden, Germany, etc. You got to control your borders. You know, you can't be altruistic and say we want to help all these people because you can't help all those people.
Mm.
You're talking about millions of people. Like you're just going to destroy your own culture and like you cannot have open borders and a welfare state at the same time. You just can't.
Um,
Get race
what do
out,
you
you know.
what do you think about libertarians with an open border perspective on things?
Well, see, libertarians want to, they'll say that, but if you look at the whole package, libertarians are saying, yeah, open the border, also don't have welfare.
Mm.
Because libertarians wouldn't believe in government anything. So they're like, they wouldn't have you getting food stamps and all that and getting free everything. They wouldn't have your government paying for your health care. You wouldn't have your government doing that. So all the incentives that come leech off the system. Well, if you're not taxing people to pay other people, because that's the main part of libertarianism, right? Is like, why do you got to steal my money? Because taxation is theft, and
Mm.
give it to this person.
No doubt.
Well, if you didn't have that
Yep.
part, I doubt there would be so many migrants running across the border. Because the only reason to do it would be as if you actually were going to become a viable citizen, get a job, and contribute.
Well, also it's also like the fact that in a libertarian or anarchist state, everyone would be armed. So when it comes to things like crime, um, there's a massive deterrent there, of course, because if this has been shown in the United States, for example. I can't remember what county it was that made it compulsory for every household to own a gun, and home invasions went down hugely. So in a state like that, of course,
Yeah,
crime is going to be pretty deterred.
I mean, where I'm from, which is part of North Carolina, we have never had a shooting. Like the murder
Hmm.
rate last year on till the fucking 1500s, no one's ever been shot, and we've always been
And
allowed to have
they loose
guns.
gun laws, right?
Guns have always been legal. Um, it's not like everyone owns one, but everyone's allowed to, and not one person has ever been shot. But we
Hmm.
also don't have. We're it's almost a completely Native American and Caucasian society. It's an island, and they don't kill each other.
Hmm.
Um, so there's something about fostering this subculture of entitlement that gets people to feel like you owe them, and so it's okay to steal, or it's okay to break the law, and blaming their failings on police or the white man or whatever. instead of themselves. They don't foster a sense of responsibility. I mean, in Japan, I could go leave a wad of money in the train station and no one would touch it. I've left the wallet on accident before and got it back with $200 in it. It's like it's not mine. You could leave a camera there and you could go film it. I might try this. Just go set something expensive and the worst thing someone might do is pick it up and bring it to the station master because they don't want it to get rained on or whatever. Like that
Mm.
that is a society of responsible people and
I
honor.
remember hearing after the tsunami years ago, people finding like valued possessions and just handing them into the police station, like
Yeah,
in
sure.
droves. Like there was no looting or anything.
Yeah, and if that, I mean, you're talking about 20,000 people died and entire prefectures were underwater briefly, right? So to scale far worse than Katrina or, a hurricane, right? But you have massive looting there because the idea is we've created this subculture through Subner Redstone Media and so on, this MTV generation of like, I'm gonna get my free shit. It's
Mm.
like someone owes you that stuff. And there's also a lot of status around it, like the brands and stuff. It like makes you, and you know that's just trash. And trash comes in all colors. But if you
Yep.
fix these liberal policies that encourage that behavior, then you won't have that behavior.
Mm.
You can minimize it at least.
Sure. I mean, I find with the millennial generation, especially, I'm a millennial myself, obviously, but there is this massive entitlement um, part of it, which
There's
I
a
think
whole
is
bunch of
incredibly negative.
millennial communists. They
Yeah.
just want people to give them. They want to have adolescence indefinitely. Like
Yeah.
they don't want college to continue for the rest of their life. Whereas people feed you and you have a place to stay and all that, and
Mm.
it just you don't really work. You just freaking LARP about. They want that. They just want something for nothing.
Mm.
And to me, all these like SJWs, feminists, etc., it's just control freak authoritarians with a theme. Feminists are control freak authoritarians with a girl power theme. And SJWs, they just want to control other people's behavior, but of course, it's always on behalf of someone else, right? And it's
It's
like,
all about control.
yeah, I
Yep.
don't see a lot of I don't see a lot of these minority groups that they're pontificating about saving or helping or whatever out there saying it.
No.
It's mostly a bunch of white people dressed up, in black and red with communist flags and stuff,
Yep.
screaming about fascism, KKK, homophobic, sexist, racist, blah blah blah. It ain't the minority saying that. It's the white kids doing that, and it's like because they've grown up uh, on a steady diet of liberal bullshit.
Yep.
And they think the only reason that some groups don't succeed as much as others must be because of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. It can't possibly be their own behavior. No,
Mm.
it's
There's no
you don't finish
agency.
high school, and you're most likely not going to do as well as if you had, you know.
Sure.
But again, people get enticed by that drug war. Say, why the hell should I go to school if I can
Mm.
make so much money doing this and it's so easy?
Mm.
Some good-looking girls like, well, why would I go to college and spend all this money to go to college just because it's too expensive now, when I can just have sex and make $1,000 a day or something, like, and so some of them tap out. You know, those lucrative
With
black markets are luring people away from more productive roles. I think you should decriminalize all the drugs
mm.
and legalize and
I
regulate prostitution. I'm not advocating those behaviors. I'm just
In
saying you could
Australia and
take
New
away the
Zealand, we
lucrative
actually
black
have
market from it.
legal prostitution.
What's that?
In Australia and New Zealand, we actually have legal prostitution,
All right.
only in certain parts. Like there are legal brothels, but there still do tend to be illegal prostitutes um, on the street, for example, who and it does happen sometimes. The illegal
Sure.
prostitutes are treated terribly.
Well, it
But then
could
you
be the,
have
the zones where it's available. In Australia, everything's so far apart from everything else. So they just, I don't know. But yeah, there'll always be a black market until you just legalize it everywhere or whatever. But
those.
yeah, and I'm not saying people should do drugs or become whores.
Mm.
I'm just saying, since people are doing those things, if you got rid of the market incentives and you couldn't make so much money doing it, I doubt so many people would do it.
Yeah. Well, then, it's been shown that the negative consequences are far less severe if it's already legal.
Sure,
For
and
example,
for drug addiction, you can go get help without,
yeah,
worrying like, well, if I tell someone, I might go to jail.
the way
Especially
the
because a lot of
states,
drugs are addictive. Like, so they want to stop, but they have trouble. They have physical addictions. So, yeah, I mean, it should be treated like a medical problem. Someone's hooked
absolutely.
on heroin.
I don't
Uh,
know, I don't understand the thought process of some people. You get these incredibly authoritarian conservatives who just say, look, there's no excuse for it. And for example, um, this rapper named Lil Peep just died. He just overdosed on
okay.
Xanax. It was laced with fentanyl. And there's all these people saying, like on the conservative side, oh, he got what was coming to him. He deserved it, kind of thing. And this guy was 21 years old. And it's like, can you not just take a step back and have some sympathy for the guy? Obviously, there's something pushing him to his drug use.
Yeah. I mean, I would say share it. Like, people seem to be on one side of the fence or the other. And I would say,
Mm.
look, he was definitely being irresponsible, but man, he died. And would his life have been saved had he been able to, seek help without fearing consequences?
Yep.
And a lot of these prescription drugs are as deadly as the street drugs.
No, they are. Yeah.
Like, America's had guns for centuries. We didn't have these random mass shootings until pretty recent times after the advent of SSRIs. And one of the first major ones that hit the headlines was Columbine. And these kids were jacked up on Prozac and stuff. And then, like, look, could it be that some of these mind-altering drugs, messing with serotonin, have a very adverse effect on a certain percentage of the population?
Mm.
Because there's overwhelmingly, like, there's millions of people taking these drugs, and they're not all out shooting people. Okay,
No.
but everybody has a little bit different biology than everyone else. And
Mm.
there aren't mass shooters that aren't on these drugs. There hasn't been a sober single one. Every single one of them's been on one of these or another. So it's kind of a catch-22 because if someone has mental problems, you give them these drugs, and then of
Sure.
course, so it's like, well, were they doing that because they're mentally ill, or a combination of being mentally ill and on these drugs?
Yeah, it's hard to tell.
It is hard to tell, but what we said, we've always had people who are mentally ill, right? It's not like
Mm.
people were born not mentally ill in the 70s and 80s, but we did not always have these mass shootings.
Mm. Okay, I better head off now. Thanks a lot, Ryan, for the conversation. It was very good. I'd like to talk again sometime.